Minister is a dispute resolution professional. For over 25 years, he served in court-based programs in Mahoning, Ashtabula, and Trumbull counties, where he mediated a wide variety of cases and provided related services. Since his retirement from the court in 2011, he has served as part-time pastor at Woodworth Church of the Brethren in Youngstown. John studied theology at Mount St. Mary Seminary in Cincinnati and counseling at Youngstown State University. He and his wife, Margie Minghetti, make their home in Mineral Ridge, Ohio. And so that is the little blurb. We'll go back and welcome John. Thank you for joining us tonight. And certainly if we need any time to know when how to do civil discourse, this is the time to do it. So we'll let you go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Mary. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be with you this evening. And as Mary indicated, my association with her and with Jack goes back quite a long time, happily. And also my association with Jefferson and with Ashtabula County. I worked there in the court system between 1997 and 2006. Just by way of taking a look at where I'd like to go this evening, I'm going to go back to Mary's notes in the newsletter. Somebody came up with the idea to bill this as an evening with John Polanski, and I personally cannot think of anything more boring, possibly. That being said, my intention is to share some ideas, very serious ideas, but take them seriously without taking ourselves too seriously, and hopefully we can have a little bit of fun in the course of discussing such a significant topic. I also want to say that I'm proud to have been a part of the effort in Ashtabula County within their court system that began over 25 years ago and continues to this day. This effort provides what many people have experienced as an effective and very easily accessible program, county-wide program through the courts that has enabled really thousands of Ashtabula County residents to participate actively in resolving a variety of disagreements, disputes over things like small claims cases, disputes involving evictions and foreclosures, disputes between parents in divided families, all kinds of disagreements for all that period of time have been addressed and resolved through trained and experienced and I believe highly talented court personnel as well as lawyers throughout the county. And that I had a chance for a time to be a part of that is something that continues to be a great reason for gratitude on my part. Thanks to Mary and some other folks involved in our presentation tonight. You're going to have a chance to make comments and ask questions in the course of the presentation. So I like to say I used to teach junior high, so I'm accustomed to being interrupted, and I promise you I will not have to go all the way back to the beginning of the presentation and start over. If you do have a comment or a question, please indicate that and we will address those as we go along. Thought about entitling this presentation, Walking in a Different Direction, because as Mary indicated in the newsletter, these days with so much conflict in our local communities, as well as at the state and national level, it will be good to learn again how to listen and treat each other in a civil way. I couldn't have put it any better myself, not so much simply for the course of this presentation, but in general, throughout our lives, personally and even in the smallest interactions, the idea that somehow we have neglected or forgotten or set aside what I think is kind of an innate understanding of how important it is to deal with each other in an honorable and respectful way. That seems to be missing, and it's the idea that it's missing on so many levels is a source of discouragement and even sadness to an awful lot of people. Certainly, disagreement has been a part of human relationships forever. I mean, if you read the Bible and you go back to the story of Cain and Abel, there is a part of our DNA almost that recognizes that we do not always see things in the same way. And so the reality of that and how we appear to be at this time in our history, in a time when that is exaggerated and maybe even deliberately so, really is discouraging and dismays an awful lot of us, with the idea that it is apparently increasing, both in terms of frequency and in terms of severity. Pretty much anyone that you talk with is likely to acknowledge this apparent recent increase in a lack of civility. Really leaves us at a loss about what to do to address it. There seems to be kind of a feeling of helplessness almost when we read or listen or even witness incidents locally and internationally to highlight this idea that this reality has made a very strong impression on our lives. And that feeling of helplessness is certainly something that we all vibrate against. That's not a part of who we are, and we really long for something that we can do to address that within ourselves and within our communities. Hopefully, we're going to be able to get into that, at least to some extent, this evening. So many aspects of our social interactions are affected by this lack of civility, of civil discourse, and of people's choice not to be engaged in it. And I want to offer just two examples that for me are of particular interest. The first one, deliberately so, has to do with voting. There are local and county-wide policies that seem to be in interference with each other or with people's ability to vote easily, to register, to be present without interference at a polling place. State regulations that attempt to deal with that very often seem to come across in a very partisan fashion and therefore lose their effectiveness. Federal protections or desires to establish processes to address those things also seem to be hindered by conflicts within political parties, among candidates themselves. And all of that so seemingly political maneuvering really does fly in the face of something that is and ought to be considered very much a part of who we are as a nation. The second idea or reality where I believe the lack of civility in our discourse is very evident is with regard to the idea of how to address our pandemic in school settings. Boards of education meet and often devolve very rapidly into an argument that drifts farther and farther away from the safety of school children and school staff members. State proposals regarding regulations get bogged down by opposition that seems to be based in an opposite direction than that safety, that protection of those that are involved in the education process. Federal mandates become present and seem to do very little, not just to address the issue, but to water down the friction and the animosity that gets built up around it. Of course, there are a lot of other examples. Those are just two that seem to be very much in the forefront in our consciousness. And I think therefore call on us not just to develop an awareness about the lack of civility, but come up with really personal and community-wide and effective ways to address it. Addressing and resolving conflict through civil discourse is arguably a necessary component for society in general and for government in particular. One of the things that I think we do very often is to start blaming and accusing and pointing fingers, when really what we ought to do is recognize that the responsibility is with all of us when it comes to addressing this reality, to recognizing the place where we are currently with regard to our discourse, and to appreciating that the only way we are going to effectively respond to it is by doing it together. We seem to be relying or wanting to rely on someone else to take care of it. The primary task exists perhaps with all those engaged in a democracy such as ours, both for those who exercise leadership as well as for the citizenry in general. Again, it's hardly something that is going to be accomplished from the top down. We need also to recognize the role that we have in this, because it is such a basic aspect of our human interaction on a day-to-day basis. One often hears about the idea of identifying common ground. And that's really a lot more than just a noble idea. I see it as rather a necessity in order to assure what most of us recognize as something that is truly important to our common well-being. The good news is that people everywhere are becoming involved through creative and imaginative ways of practically planning to move individuals and communities in a different direction. Sadly, a lot of this does not get publicized. And when it does, it's very often pushed aside as something that maybe is too little too late, or something that is not practical and certainly can't be measured in any way as being effective. When I hear those kinds of things, I think about what began over 25 years ago in Ashtabula County, and now is very much a part of the judicial and legal culture in the county. It's impossible, I would say, even though I don't get to have a lot of time in the county these days, it's impossible for me to imagine that there is a practicing attorney in Ashtabula County that has not had experience, or at least does not have some knowledge of the mediation program that exists at the court, how to access it, how to explain to clients the way that they can make use of it. So the reality of people making that effort is something that's very real, and is a source of a lot of hope to me. So again, I invite all of us to take a little bit of time to look at what we mean by these terms like civil discourse and conflict management and dispute resolution, and consider how to employ them in various ways that can have a significant impact on the present and the future of our society. Questions or comments at this point? Okay. Many of us can remember someone in our youth who instilled an understanding of the importance of how to address disagreement. Perhaps it was a parent, a teacher, a coach, a pastor, someone who took the time to instruct us not only on what we can do when an argument flares, but why it is so important to take positive steps in that direction. I think that the fact that people continue to do this, people continue in a classroom, on a sports field, and in whatever setting, to let especially to let young people know that if all you do when you think about being in an argument is how to prevail, or how to simply show the weaknesses of the other side of the issue, or how to insist that the only way to see it is the way that you do, people are beginning to understand the necessity of that, not just for youngsters, but for all of us. If we have in fact forgotten that lesson, to relearn it so that we really can express it to younger generations. Because part of what we're dealing with is the manner in which our culture approaches disagreement, and how that, as we observed earlier, seems to have disintegrated into simply insistence over who's right, with no consideration of the consequences of that. The idea that our culture is somehow based on this idea that the importance of the individual is so much greater than the well-being of the community really does fly in the face of everything on which history tells us our country is based. So if we look at this idea of civil discourse and make an attempt at defining it, it might be in this fashion: doing what is necessary to listen to one another, respect ideas and opinions, and identify what we can accomplish together. Each piece of that loose, informal definition, I think, is worth a little bit of consideration. First of all, doing what is necessary. I think beginning at the personal level, what we need to do very simply and very significantly is to avoid being discouraged or intimidated by the enormity of the task. All of us have had that feeling when we look at a headline or listen to a news report about a simple disagreement that goes terribly, terribly wrong, sometimes very tragically so. It's understandable why we just kind of throw up our hands, either literally or figuratively, and say, look, I'm going to stay as far away from this as possible. I'm going to make sure that when a disagreement happens, I'm going to run the other way. And of course, that's impossible. It's impossible for us to avoid not just differences of opinion, but sometimes even very significant positions in which we find ourselves. Something that I believe clashes with what something that you believe. That's something that we experience all the time. And so to imagine that we can somehow exist by simply ignoring or denying those realities is something that really makes no sense. It's extremely impractical. To listen to one another. When I was not just training mediators, but when I was doing mediation myself, I found very often that I was talking with the parties that were involved in the disagreement about some of the basics of human communication, and especially with the importance of listening. I'd often say how my Irish grandmother used to point out that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we should listen twice as much as we speak. So just some basic ideas like that are so much a fabric of who we are tend to get set aside or forgotten about, even though they're incredibly important. For example, the idea of listening to convince instead of listening to understand. The idea that listening involves silence to a much greater degree than we sometimes imagine. All those things are some of the basics of civil discourse. And when we skip over those, or when we imagine that they don't count for very much, I think we're missing the opportunity to really connect with something that is so easy to appreciate and sometimes so difficult to actually practice. All kinds of basic communication skills, of course, go along with that. The idea of pausing before we respond, the idea of recognizing when we begin to simply push our own ideas rather than consideration of those that the other person has. Respecting ideas and opinions. Respectful discourse, I think, is another way to look at this notion of civil discourse. That my disagreement of your ideas, of your thoughts, of your imagination, of the way that you see the world, is the quickest way to move apart from resolving our differences, of communicating in an effective way. The idea that my acceptance of who you are and what you're saying means that I agree with you is not necessarily the case. And so the first step, if you will, toward being able to hear what you have to say is to begin by telling myself, I respect this person even though I disagree completely with their point of view and the way that they're presenting it. That notion of respect of the person supersedes respect for their opinions and ideas. And I think that too is a very significant aspect of discoursing in a civil way. Finally, identifying what we can accomplish together. I mentioned a little bit ago the concept of common ground and where we stand together in order to address the issues that really do concern us all. This is something that seems to be forgotten pretty quickly, that what matters to you very much matters to me, and vice versa. And we seem to so easily get caught up in the way that we're talking about or yelling about what it is that matters to us, can allow us to forget very quickly that those things really do count for both of us. They matter to our well-being. And that common ground is really the only place where we can stand if we are to map out a way to address what concerns us all. Putting civil discourse to work, addressing conflict within our culture, I think, is something that seems to be so large as to be unmanageable. And it's understandable when a person might believe, well, what can I do as an individual that's going to have any impact at all on that reality, that conflict in our culture is something that is so powerful that it would seem as though one person or a small group of people even could have very little impact on it. I want to get back to Mary's reference in the newsletter about learning again how to listen and treat each other in a civil way. Something like that, as basic as it is, really has a lot of significance that we might miss if we're not careful. In that we're all taught something about conflict from the time that we're young. We're taught, for example, to stand our ground. We're taught to let people know without being ashamed what it is that we think about a particular idea. We're taught, perhaps, hopefully, to recognize how it is that a resolution must involve both points of view in order to be able to have it last and to have a really significant way of addressing the concerns that we share. Whether from families or teachers or friends, or even from our national culture, these kinds of lessons in a way, they're like gravity, in the sense that they're very difficult to escape. We carry those with us, those notions about how to deal with conflict by moving toward it, or perhaps moving away from it, denying it or accepting it, trying to minimize it or trying to appreciate its place in our society. Whatever it is, these are very much a part of who we are. One example of that is the desire to be right. And that's an awfully powerful stimulant, I think we're recognizing, for human behavior. And it seems to be an unhappy byproduct, in a way, of our national heritage of independence, that my rights, my individual personal rights, matter to me more than anything else. And that leads me, of course, to fail to recognize or to minimize or to set aside the rights that other people have. It also leads to the manner in which we endeavor to resolve conflict, whether formally or informally, in our personal interactions, our professional relationships, and many more aspects of our lives. That insistence that if I'm not able to address or resolve something that is going to satisfy me, if I can't do it at this level, then I'll find another way to do it. I'll appeal to another court. I'll perhaps engage in some kind of behavior that is very destructive to others and to myself. So that notion that someone has to prevail when we have a disagreement is perhaps one of the greatest obstacles that we overcome when it comes to addressing a more civil way of discourse. The court system obviously exists primarily as a way of resolving disputes. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the fact that the Ashtabula County court system has become such a great example of productive, less adversarial ways of addressing conflict and resolving it is something that that the county needs to be proud of, needs to be more aware of, I think, because people with less serious disputes to have to be resolved than those that are often presented to courts can learn from that kind of a structure when an institution like the court system, like the legal system, recognizes and appreciates the way that less adversarial means of addressing conflict exist, and they can be accessed by people without a long and involved process, is what leads us to have hope that we too can find ways to create ways of resolving conflict that are within the reach of all of us. Schools and businesses are also developing programs for identifying problems early and providing training so that peers can provide appropriate assistance in resolving their disagreements. One of the most gratifying things that I've ever witnessed as a dispute resolution professional is to watch two middle school students work with a trained peer mediator. So someone that is one of their classmates that can sit down with them and help them to address something about which they are both very passionate. And when those disagreements are identified early enough, and when the process is made available to students, and they're trained and supervised by people who care about helping them to learn that process, it's tremendously impressive to watch. I had a chance to talk with a group of peer mediators in a middle school and ask them what they do, for example, when they run into an impasse between the parties that they're dealing with. And immediately one of the students said, well, that's when you ask more questions. And that's, I've worked with trained mediators, experienced mediators that forget that basic lesson. And to see a youngster that really appreciated how a step like that can really move a resolution forward was really gratifying to witness. That there are such simple, essential aspects to civil discourse and dispute resolution is something that I think really is important for us to be aware of. First of all, is commitment to the process. I've already mentioned, probably because it impresses me, or it is something that I feel very much, this idea that it's so easy to be overwhelmed by what we're seeing right before our eyes in terms of the disintegration of civil discourse in our society. And so when I feel helpless in the face of that, I'm just going to say, why should I even bother? Why should I make the effort at all? Why should I learn for myself or encourage other people to learn along with me? And to be committed to that process, not only of civil discourse, but of helping to manage conflict and resolve disagreements in a productive, less adversarial way, is something that's incredibly important to the growth of that process within our culture. Learning and practicing good communication skills. Those things that, as somebody observed, all the important things I know I learned in kindergarten about what it means to move into an area of disagreement with mutual respect, with concern for the other, with the idea that I honor who that person is, even though we have a disagreement. Those are the kinds of things that we really do benefit when we learn them ourselves, because there's no better way to teach that than by modeling it in the way that we approach a disagreement. Supporting and encouraging local efforts of all kinds without regard to affiliation. I think so often, without intending to, we put out the idea that we want you to be a part of this, but only if you share our point of view. I think we need to really emphasize, first of all, for ourselves, but then for everyone with whom we are involved, that this is a step in the right direction that can only be taken by all of us when we look beyond the differences that we have. Seeking out opportunities to engage others. We have so many ways that we share our relationships in organizations, in churches, across the community, through whatever kind of connections that we have, to really urge each other and support each other in this notion that we will never accomplish so much individually as we can when we do it together. Again, that sounds so basic, and that's why I'm so discouraged when I see how many times we fail to engage each other in that way. So those are just some basic beginning ideas, many of which we've all heard before, and perhaps therefore tend to neglect their importance. But I think they really do matter an awful lot. I want to once again thank Mary Howe and the League of Women Voters Ashtabula County for this invitation to be with you. And I certainly appreciate your attention and your interest during the presentation. For a long time, my sister has sported a sticker on the bumper of her car that's always intrigued me: more curiosity, less judgment. Too many of us want to respond to the reality that we are facing with regard to our discourse and the way that we address and attempt to resolve conflict by nostalgically recalling a time when discourse was not so abrasive, or wishing that there was some kind of a simple solution to this very important aspect of human interaction. Fact is, it's really not such a complicated effort that is before us. And the rewards for engagement at this deeper level can be more significant than many of us imagine, because it makes so much more sense for you and for me and as many as we can gather to begin learning to listen and to speak with respect and care, so that we can take the simple steps that will lead us in a different and hopefully more productive direction. Thank you once again, and I'm happy to listen to any comments or questions that you may have.
I just wanted to say one comment that I belong to the United Methodist Church, and as a whole, the church is really struggling right now with the LGBTQ issue. And one of the things that a former pastor really stressed is that we go into any discussion about anything with the thought that I may be wrong. And we need to always keep that in mind, that, you know, we have definite opinions about things, but I may be wrong. So it's something to remember, that we're not always right, and we don't have to always be right.
And when our fears get engaged, it immediately holds that up, you know, that if I can be right, I don't have to be so afraid.
Right. Does anybody else have a comment or a question? Okay, Jack has a comment here.
Thank you, John. So good to see you. I tried to engage. This was some time ago. It was about a year ago. After Mass, a man that is 180 degrees on the other side of some really federal issues. We gathered just briefly to have a chat, and I says, you know, I really like to talk to you some more and see if we couldn't find some common ground, I could feel my stomach tensing, and I could feel him tensing. And I asked a couple of questions, and he came back with some very quick answers that were very more attacking than defensive on his part. And I found it so easy for me to give up, you know. And then he went on to say, well, you know, there is a group that does something like what you're talking about, Jack, that are really trying to work through this stuff. But I found my mind going, oh yeah, I'll bet they're all on your side. So we never went any further with that, and yet, like you say, you've got to really let your own guard down and be willing to learn. I think back, and I'm not sure how similar this is to what we're discussing, because in my work, my last 10 years, I was human resources and labor relations, and I would deal with grievance, and I found, or even a customer. This was public welfare, public assistance, and I had just angry people. And I had this one incident that I remember so vividly. I took the party, it was a husband and wife, into my office. I had them sit down, and they could see me typing their responses. And I was kind of on the edge of, am I being manipulative, or am I really sincere here? And I think I was more sincere than I was manipulative. But I found that the seriousness with which I took their complaint, and even showing that I was recording it, just took the wind right out of the sails. I mean, it was like magic, you know. And once with a grievant, they said, you know, I didn't get the job. I'm so angry. And I said, yeah, I'd be angry if I were you too. Yeah. That's an awful blow. And I felt, in a way, afterwards, felt bad about it, because I said, maybe you're just manipulating, because they went out to the union rep and said, I just had this wonderful conversation with Jack. He agreed with me. He says, no, he agreed you were upset. He didn't agree with the decision, you know. But I find myself in an individual relationship with someone that's so far apart in our thinking. The physical part taking over, the blood pressure, the tenseness, and it's if I could just calm that down long enough and say, no, he's a child of God too. Let's hear him out. And let's see if I couldn't take the initiative in trying to find something in his point that I might agree with. So it's so challenging, and yet it's so simple.
It is, Jack. Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. And you know, the notion that you started with of where is this common ground? I think it's a question that we so rarely ask, or when we do, it's much later than it can really be helpful. I think it's a question we need to look at right at the beginning. Is what is it that we share? What is it that we both want? And it takes so much time to get there. And it's so worthwhile because we really do recognize, you know what, we both want to get through this day and be able to smile at the end of it. We both want to have our children and our grandchildren come home safely from school. We both want our community to be one that people enjoy being a part of. There's really so much. And the interesting thing to me over time has been how that common ground sometimes can have very little apparently to do with the resolution of the disagreement. I don't think it matters. It's just the idea that there is more that we have in common than we disagree with. And we're so scared to get to that point because it means, as we've been saying, it means letting go of what I want in favor of what we need. And that's a lesson that I learned over and over again.
One other thing I think that works against me personally is the television and the current political ads for the senator, U.S. Senator to succeed Portman. They make me ill, and we're turning channels just not to listen to them because it's so disturbing. Yeah. and so we have all of that working against us up to a point.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have a comment? Just chime in if you do, or raise your hand or something. Unmute though first.
I just wanted to share a book that I'm currently reading called Defund Fear by Zach Norris. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with, as you say, so much of the conflict is fear-based. Mm-hmm. and that we want to punish people, and it's trying to look at getting away from punishing to, restoring, mm-hmm. The people involved or groups or situations. It's very well written, and it's kind of validates what you were saying about the fear. And what Jack was saying. It's so visceral, it's so physical. Oh, yeah. You feel it. I feel it in my chest, in my throat. When I want, it's like the words get stuck. But thank you very much. Appreciate your time and expertise.
Thanks, Maureen. Yeah, that whole notion of fear and how it affects not just our desire to be right, but when I've asked people, what are you afraid of? It always, or almost always, comes down to the idea, I'm afraid that things are not going to turn out the way I want them to. And you and I have zero control over that. We have no control whatsoever over the way things turn out. So when we can begin to say, how can we help each other, not knowing what the future is going to be, then the fear seems to decrease, at least to some extent, because I start to realize, hey, I'm not in this by myself. And that's a big part of that. Thanks for that.
I'd just like to thank you, John, too, for your remarks. I was a counselor, and I had 11 years. I worked with junior high students, and we ran this peer mediation program. And I think the other thing you said, the last thing you said about you could feel if you can use this technique, then you don't have one person that's higher up than the other. You're kind of at a common ground and you start with equal power or whatever.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point, Terry, because so often in disagreements, when I realize that you're different than I am, and that's what we often see in disagreements is the difference between me and the other person. And if we are different, one of us has to be better, and it must be me. So when we stand on level ground, as you say, that's a big step forward.
Anyone else have anything, question or comment? Lorna?
I would just like to add, I was a kindergarten teacher, and we in the school did conflict resolution. And I found that real helpful with even 5-year-olds,
Yes.
using I statements and reflective listening. In other words, if there was a conflict, one would have to say, I hear you say, so that they had to actually verbalize what the other person was saying, because I think we have become such poor listeners. When someone's talking, all you're thinking about is how you're going to react to it, or what you're going to say in response to it. You're not really listening to what the person is saying, because you have your own agenda. I just think a lot of these skills, and they are skills, have to be learned at a really young age. You know, the give and take of every situation. You know, like you say, there are two sides, and it's all equal. And also, I'd like to bring up the point of being vulnerable.
Yes.
Because when you're in this situation, the sense of vulnerability, I think, is real prevalent. And I think it's important to recognize that too.
Yeah, we're all scared of something. And yeah, for sure. And that other point, Lorna, that you made, that I hope I mentioned because it is so critical, is listening to respond as opposed to listening to understand. And sometimes in mediations, I would ask the participants if they would not mind counting to 5 before they open their mouth. And just in 5 seconds, in the time that it gives me to be aware of what the other person said. And I was always gratified to see that they waited for more than 5 seconds, because they knew that this was their chance, not just to tell the other person why they were wrong. It was a chance for them to say, I hear what you said. This is what I heard you say. And that people had never done that before. It was just, you know, kind of sad. But the fact they were doing it now was, of course, very helpful.
Well, if we don't have any other comments, I certainly want to thank John for joining us tonight. It was nice to do it over Zoom, so he didn't have to come up from Mineral Ridge. I'm not quite sure where Mineral Ridge is, but it's south of here, so that was nice.
I'm 40 miles south on Route 46. Okay,
that's not too bad then. Jessica, if you could give us just a brief explanation of what the March meeting will be. And again, it's another one of our league meetings, but this one is we're going to have to practice our civil discourse perhaps during it, or listening. Hopefully people will have practiced it before a little bit, but go ahead, Jessica, explain.
Oh, I don't know. So on March 22nd, 7 p.m. via Zoom, so exactly a month from tonight, we will be hosting State School Board Representative Merle Johnson, along with Akron School Board President Dr. NJ Akbar, and then Ashtabula Area City Schools Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, and also Ashtabula City Councilwoman, Relicia Holman. And the topic is going to be centered more or less on honesty in education, and we're going to try to stay away, I think, from some specific legislation and talk more to some of the issues related to trying to censor divisive topics in education. So I think that we will be practicing some level of mutual understanding. It's probably the best way to go about it. But yeah, it will be a little bit different vibe, I'm guessing, next month, but it will definitely be educational, because there is a lot of things happening in schools right now that we need to be aware of.
For sure, for sure. There's more and more some of the House bills that I think I've sent out some notices that people need to be aware of some of the things that are going on that are kind of scary for schools, especially right now. Okay, thank you all for attending. Thank you, John, for attending, and certainly hope that you could be with us next month in March. John, join us if you're interested. We'll continue sending our newsletter to you if you're interested.
Please do.
All right.
Thanks,
we will.
Jessica. Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, Jessica. We thank Jessica, who does all of our technical stuff to get us online. We would have been lost the last couple of years without her. Thank goodness she joined us and is willing to do all of this. So we appreciate that. All right, thank you, everybody. Stay safe. Don't go out on the ice tomorrow. If we have ice, be very careful. One fall, you know, as we learn as we get older, one fall can finish us off. So let's not have that happen to anybody. So stay well, and we'll be in touch with everybody. Thank you, especially the newer members. We're glad to have you joining us on this. Take care.
It's
good night,
to see everybody.
Thank you.
So nice